January 17, 1945. The frozen hills of the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The air tasted of iron and ash. Snow lay thick across the pine-covered ridges, muffling the world into a deceptive stillness. In a commandeered farmhouse 5 kilometers west of St. Vith, Oberstleutnant Heinrich Vogel stood before a frost-covered window, watching the pale dawn struggle against the overcast sky. His breath condensed in small clouds. Behind him, a crackling radio receiver hissed and popped, occasionally spitting fragmentary reports from forward positions. The coffee in his tin cup had gone cold an hour ago. Outside, the hulks of 3 Tiger II tanks sat abandoned along the muddy track, their massive forms rendered impotent not by American ground forces, but by something Vogel had not fully comprehended until 3 days prior, something that arrived not from the earth, but from the sky, coordinated with a precision that seemed almost mechanical in its efficiency. He pressed his palm against the icy glass. Somewhere to the west, beyond the tree line, beyond the American positions, beyond the doctrine and the maps and the carefully laid plans of the Wehrmacht's last great offensive, lay an industrial nation that had transformed war itself. Vogel had fought in Poland, France, and deep into the Soviet Union. He understood combined arms. He understood blitzkrieg. But what the Americans had brought to these frozen hills was something different. A synthesis of air and ground power so seamless that it functioned less like 2 military branches cooperating and more like a single, sprawling organism with eyes in the clouds and fists on the earth. The radio crackled. Thunderbolt inbound. Sector 7. All units take cover. Repeat, all units. Static consumed the rest. Vogel closed his eyes. He knew what would follow. First, the sound, a rising growl that would become a scream. Then the earth would shake. Then the reports would trickle in, another fuel convoy destroyed, another command post obliterated, another carefully prepared counterattack scattered before it could even form. The Americans had turned the sky into a weapon that never slept, never blinked, and, most critically, never lost track of what was happening on the ground below. In the autumn of 1939, when the German Wehrmacht rolled through Poland with a speed that stunned the world, the concept of combined arms had reached what many believed to be its apex. The synchronization of panzers, motorized infantry, and Stukas had shattered enemy formations with a psychological and tactical efficiency that redefined modern warfare. By the time France fell in June of 1940, German commanders had every reason to believe they had perfected the art of coordinated combat. The Luftwaffe provided close air support when needed, but the fundamental architecture of battle remained rooted in ground maneuver. Air power was supplementary, devastating when properly employed, yes, but ultimately subordinate to the movement of divisions, the thrust of armored spearheads, the capture of terrain. This understanding persisted through the invasions of Yugoslavia, Greece, and into the vast expanses of the Soviet Union. Even as the war grew more complex, as supply lines stretched and resistance stiffened, the basic framework held. Air support was requested through traditional channels, coordinated at higher echelons, delivered when weather and availability permitted. It was powerful but episodic, devastating but not omnipresent. The sky was contested, not controlled. The ground war could, if necessary, proceed without it. The American military that began arriving in Britain in 1942 had inherited this same basic framework. Their doctrine, their organization, their equipment, all bore the fingerprints of European military tradition filtered through American industrial capacity. But something fundamental was changing, evolving in training fields across England, in planning rooms at 8th Air Force Headquarters, in the continuous exchange of information between pilots, forward air controllers, and ground commanders. The Americans were not simply replicating what had come before. They were building something new. By 1943, as American forces engaged German units in North Africa and then Sicily, Wehrmacht commanders began encountering a form of air support that felt qualitatively different from what they had experienced before. It was not merely the number of aircraft, though the numbers were indeed staggering, but the speed with which they appeared, the accuracy with which they struck, and most unsettling of all, the eerie sense that the pilots above somehow knew exactly what was happening in the churning chaos of ground combat. German officers accustomed to coordinating their own air support through formal requests and hierarchical channels found themselves facing an enemy where the boundary between air and ground seemed to have dissolved into something fluid and immediate. They did not yet understand that they were facing a revolution. Oberstleutnant Vogel had first encountered this new reality in Normandy, 7 months before that frozen morning in the Ardennes. July 1944, the hedgerows of France. His Panzer Regiment had been ordered to counterattack an American breakthrough near St. Lo. The briefing had been straightforward: punch through the American lines, retake the crossroads, disrupt their advance. His Tigers and Panthers would provide the armored fist, supported by 2 battalions of Panzer Grenadiers. The plan was sound. The ground favored defense, and his crews were veterans. The attack began at dawn. Within 20 minutes, it had disintegrated. He remembered the sound first, a distinctive drone that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then the shapes appeared, low against the horizon, P-47 Thunderbolts, not in the neat formations he had expected, but in a continuous stream, as if someone had opened a tap in the sky and American fighter bombers simply poured forth without end. They came in waves, rocket rails gleaming, 8.50 caliber machine guns per aircraft hammering the ground with a volume of fire that seemed to physically press the earth flat. What stunned Vogel was not simply the violence. He had endured Katyusha barrages on the Eastern Front, had watched Sturmovix tear through German positions with brutal efficiency, but the precision. The Thunderbolts were not carpet bombing the general area. They were hitting his specific tanks. As his Panthers maneuvered toward the attack position, American aircraft would appear within minutes, not hours. As his command half-track relocated, it would come under fire before it had traveled 500 meters. As his infantry dispersed into the hedgerows, high-explosive rockets would bracket their exact positions. Someone, somewhere, was watching everything he did. And more importantly, they were telling the pilots. The counterattack died in the fields south of St. Lo. Of the 42 tanks Vogel had commanded that morning, 17 burned by midday. The rest withdrew, not because they had been defeated by American armor, they had barely engaged the American ground forces, but because they could not survive in the open air long enough to reach the enemy. The sky had become impassable. In the months that followed, as Vogel's regiment was rebuilt and reorganized, he began collecting information. He spoke with other commanders who had faced the Americans. He read captured documents when they became available. He questioned prisoners. Slowly, an image emerged of a system so comprehensive, so deeply integrated, that it functioned less like military coordination and more like a single nervous system spanning earth and sky. The Americans, he learned, had created something they called forward air controllers, specially trained officers embedded with frontline units whose sole purpose was to direct aircraft onto targets. These controllers carried radio equipment that allowed them to communicate directly with pilots overhead, bypassing the traditional chain of command that had governed air support for decades. When American ground forces encountered resistance, they did not file a request that would work its way up through division, to corps, to air liaison officers, and eventually, perhaps, result in aircraft appearing hours later. Instead, a forward air controller would mark the target with colored smoke, contact aircraft already circling overhead or racing toward the battlefield, and guide them onto the target in real time, often within minutes. But even this innovation was only part of the answer. The true revolution lay in the infrastructure behind it, the way the Americans had reorganized their entire air-ground relationship from the ground up. Fighter-bomber squadrons were assigned to support specific ground units and maintained constant patrols over designated sectors. Pilots were briefed on friendly troop positions before takeoff. Communication networks linked ground forces, forward air controllers, and aircraft in a web of information that flowed continuously in all directions. Reconnaissance aircraft fed intelligence directly to tactical commanders. Weather reports, enemy movement, friendly positions, target priorities, all of it moved through an integrated system designed to collapse the traditional lag time between observation and action. The Americans had built a machine for seeing and striking simultaneously. German commanders had expected technological superiority. This was perhaps their greatest miscalculation, not a failure of tactics or courage, but a fundamental misreading of how the Americans approached war itself. In the Wehrmacht's experience, air superiority was achieved through fighter-to-fighter combat, through shooting down enemy aircraft until your own bombers and ground attack planes could operate with relative freedom. This was how the Luftwaffe had functioned in Poland and France. This was how the battle for Britain had been fought. Air power was about controlling the sky through aerial combat, then exploiting that control to support ground operations. The process was sequential. First dominate the air, then assist the ground. The Americans had inverted this logic. They did not view air superiority as a prerequisite for air-ground coordination. They viewed air-ground coordination as itself a form of air superiority. By making every tank commander, every infantry company, Every artillery battery a potential node in an integrated system of observation and firepower, they had transformed the entire army into an extension of air power. A German tank column was not simply vulnerable to fighter bombers because American aircraft controlled the sky. It was vulnerable because American ground forces would immediately report its position, American artillery would fix it in place, and American aircraft would arrive with a speed and precision that made evasion nearly impossible. The technology itself was not revolutionary. Radios had existed for decades. Forward observers were an ancient concept. Close air support had been practiced, in various forms, by every major military. What was revolutionary was the integration, the way the Americans had reorganized doctrine, training, equipment, and command structure to treat air and ground not as separate forces that occasionally coordinated, but as two aspects of a unified combat system. German officers had expected to face superior numbers. They had expected better equipment. What they had not expected was a conceptual leap that made their own combined arms doctrine, once the pinnacle of modern warfare, suddenly obsolete. Major Klaus Ritter, a staff officer with the 2nd Panzer Division, had written in his diary after the Falaise pocket, "We are not fighting an army with air support. We are fighting air power that happens to have an army attached. Every square kilometer of ground they occupy becomes a sensor and a designator for death from above. Our own aircraft are absent. But even if they were present in numbers, I am no longer certain it would matter. The Americans have changed the grammar of war, and we are still speaking the old language." The weather became a kind of prayer. Across the German positions in France, in the Low Countries, in the retreating columns that struggled back toward the Rhine, soldiers learned to cherish overcast skies, fog, rain, anything that grounded the American aircraft. Clear weather became a source of dread. Veterans learned to recognize the sound of different American aircraft by their engine notes, the deep rumble of P-47 Thunderbolts, the smoother growl of P-51 Mustangs, the distinctive whistle of P-38 Lightnings. They learned that the Americans flew in all but the very worst conditions. They learned that darkness provided only temporary respite, as American night fighters prowled the roads with increasing frequency. But most of all, they learned that movement in daylight was suicide. The Wehrmacht, which had pioneered mobile warfare, which had built its entire doctrine around rapid maneuver and aggressive exploitation of breakthrough, found itself increasingly paralyzed. Supply convoys that once moved freely along roads now waited for nightfall, crept forward a few kilometers, then hid before dawn. Tank formations that once raced across open country now dispersed into tree lines and villages, moving only in short dashes when the sky was momentarily empty. Artillery batteries fired a few rounds and immediately relocated, knowing that American aircraft would appear within minutes at any position that revealed itself. The psychological effect was as crippling as the physical destruction. German commanders found themselves not simply reacting to what American ground forces were doing, but to what American pilots overhead might have seen, might have reported, might have already designated for destruction. The weight of unseen eyes pressed down on every decision. Initiative, the lifeblood of German tactical doctrine, withered under a sky that punished any bold movement. Hauptmann Ernst Weber, a company commander in the 116th Panzer Division, recorded his experience during the Ardennes offensive in a letter that was never sent. "We advance at night, racing against the dawn. The men are exhausted, but they push forward because they know what daylight brings. Yesterday we gained 6 kilometers. Today, in the first hour of light, we lost 4 tanks to aircraft we never even saw until they were firing. The Americans do not need to outfight us tank to tank. They simply need to see us. And they always see us. I commanded my company for 11 months in Russia. I have been in the West for 3 months. I have learned more fear here." The systematic nature of American air-ground coordination revealed itself most clearly in the quality of targets the Germans lost. It was not random. It was not area bombardment hoping to hit something valuable. American aircraft, guided by controllers on the ground and reconnaissance reports from above, hunted specific assets with deliberate intent. Command vehicles, distinguished from ordinary trucks by their antenna arrays, were priority targets. Wehrmacht officers learned to remove extra antennas, to disguise their half-tracks, to separate themselves from their communications equipment when aircraft were overhead. But the Americans adapted faster than the Germans could hide. Forward air controllers learned to identify command elements by their position in formations, by their movement patterns, by the activity around them. Artillery positions faced similar attention. The traditional calculus of counter-battery fire, that it took time to locate enemy guns, time to coordinate response, time to bring fire to bear, collapsed under the American system. German gunners found that firing more than a few rounds from one position drew immediate airstrikes. Soviet artillery doctrine had emphasized mobility, but the Americans made mobility not just advantageous but mandatory for survival. Entire artillery battalions were suppressed not by counter-battery fire but by the simple fact that revealing their positions invited destruction from above faster than they could displace. Supply columns became special targets of opportunity. The Germans had always known logistics were vulnerable, but the American ability to interdict supply lines reached a level that strangled offensive operations. During the Ardennes offensive, Wehrmacht commanders discovered that even a successful breakthrough became hollow if the supplies to sustain it burned on the roads behind them. American fighter bombers prowled the road networks, destroying fuel trucks and ammunition convoys with a consistency that made resupply virtually impossible in daylight. Panzer divisions ground to a halt not because they were defeated in combat, but because they ran out of fuel 20 kilometers from their objectives. The J-bow, the German slang for jagged bomber, fighter bomber, became a figure of dark humor and darker fear in Wehrmacht culture. Soldiers sang bitter songs about them. Diaries filled with accounts of their attacks. The phrase, J-bow weather, entered the vocabulary as shorthand for the clear skies that meant death from above. Veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had endured Katyusha barrages and massed Soviet armor assaults, spoke of the American fighter bombers with a particular kind of exhaustion, not just fear of their weapons, but weariness at the relentless omnipresence, the sense that the sky was never truly empty, never truly safe. In the farmhouse west of St. Vith, Oberstleutnant Vogel turned from the window. His operations officer, a thin Bavarian named Steiner, was updating the situation map with grease pencil, marking new American positions. The map was a chaos of red and blue symbols, arrows, hastily scribbled notations. But what struck Vogel was what wasn't on the map, the representation of air power. Traditional military maps showed ground units, terrain, objectives. Air support, when depicted at all, appeared as abstract symbols at the margins, availability noted in separate air tasking orders. But how did you represent what the Americans had created? How did you mark on a map the fact that every American rifle company was effectively an observation post for aircraft that could arrive in minutes? How did you indicate that the entire American front was embedded in a network of radios, controllers, and circling aircraft that made the distinction between front and rear, between ground battle and air battle, increasingly meaningless? "We've lost contact with Kampfgruppe Brandt," Steiner said quietly. "Last transmission reported aircraft inbound. That was 40 minutes ago." Vogel nodded. He did not need to ask for details. The pattern was familiar. A unit would report aircraft. Then radio silence. Then, eventually, a few survivors would straggle back with accounts of how their formation had been struck repeatedly until it ceased to exist as an organized force. Not destroyed in a single catastrophic attack, the Americans rarely needed that level of overkill, but eroded. Chipped away. Forced to disperse, to hide, to abandon vehicles and equipment, until what had been a combat-effective unit became a scattered collection of individuals trying to avoid the next strafing run. "The offensive is over," Vogel said. It was not a question. Steiner looked up from the map. For a moment, something like relief passed across his face, the relief of having the truth spoken aloud. "Yes, Herr Oberstleutnant. The Ardennes offensive, Germany's last great gamble in the West, had failed for many reasons. Supply shortages, fuel scarcity, stubborn American defense at key crossroads like Bastogne. Weather that initially aided the German advance by grounding Allied aircraft, then cleared at the critical moment. But underlying all these tactical factors was a deeper strategic reality. The Wehrmacht had launched a mobile offensive into an environment where mobility itself had become fatal. They had attempted blitzkrieg against an enemy who had transformed the sky into an impassable barrier to rapid maneuver. For 4 days, heavy fog and low clouds had granted the German forces a window of opportunity. They had advanced, in some sectors, with shocking speed. American units had been overrun, surrounded, pushed back. For those 4 days, it had felt almost like the old days, like France in 1940, when German armor could race across the landscape and American forces would have to respond with the sluggish reflexes of ground-bound units trying to plug holes in the line. Then, on December 23rd, the weather had cleared. What followed was not a single devastating air attack, but a sustained campaign of interdiction that transformed the entire operational environment. American fighter bombers appeared in what German soldiers described as shifts. As soon as one group expended its ammunition and fuel, another arrived. Forward air controllers with the beleaguered American ground units began directing aircraft onto German positions with a volume and accuracy that seemed impossible. Supply columns that had been racing forward under the protective cloud cover were caught in the open and systematically destroyed. Tank formations dispersed into forests and villages, abandoning the roads that had carried them so far, so fast. The offensive didn't end in a single climactic battle. It bled out over days and weeks as the arithmetic of attrition tilted decisively against the attackers. German units found themselves unable to concentrate forces without inviting air strikes, unable to resupply forward elements, unable to exploit any tactical success because movement brought destruction. The American ground forces, now reinforced and resupplied by a logistics network that flowed freely under air cover the Germans could not contest, counterattacked with the confidence of men who knew the sky belonged to them. By mid-January, the bulge that had been driven into American lines was collapsing. Wehrmacht units withdrew, leaving behind hundreds of disabled vehicles, thousands of casualties, and the wreckage of the last German offensive of the war. And in command posts from the Ardennes to the Rhine, German officers wrote reports and after-action analyses trying to explain what had happened, trying to codify the lessons, trying to answer the question that haunted them. How do you fight an enemy who sees everything and strikes everywhere? The symbolic object that recurred in German accounts, in letters, diaries, captured documents, and post-war memoirs, was not a weapon or a tool but something more mundane, the radio. Not the large command sets that had always been part of modern warfare, but the small tactical radios that seemed to be everywhere in American units. German soldiers noticed them during counterattacks, during defensive battles, during the chaos of close combat. They noticed that even junior American officers carried radios, that isolated American positions could call for support, that the Americans seemed to coordinate their actions with an ease that suggested constant communication, constant information flow, constant connection to some larger system that extended beyond the immediate battlefield. When German forces overran American positions, the radios were there among the captured equipment, small, rugged devices that represented something more significant than mere communication technology. They represented a philosophical approach to warfare that differed fundamentally from German practice. The Wehrmacht had always maintained a clear hierarchy of command, with information flowing up and orders flowing down through established channels. It was efficient in its own way, allowing for unity of command and coherent operational planning. The Americans had decentralized authority to a degree that seemed almost anarchic to German officers educated in Prussian military tradition. Junior officers and even enlisted forward air controllers could direct devastating firepower onto targets they identified themselves. Company commanders could call for air support without routing requests through division headquarters. The vertical chain of command was supplemented, sometimes superseded, by lateral networks of communication that allowed information to flow horizontally across units and vertically between ground and air forces simultaneously. One German intelligence assessment from early 1945 noted, "The American military functions less like a classical army and more like a commercial enterprise, with each small unit empowered to make decisions and request resources from a vast pool of available assets. This creates redundancy and inefficiency in some respects, but it also creates a robustness that makes their operations difficult to disrupt. Destroying a single headquarters does not paralyze their coordination. Cutting a single communication line does not blind them. The system is cellular, distributed, resilient in ways that our more hierarchical structure is not." The radio, then, became a symbol of something larger, the democratization of firepower. In the German system, massive combat power required massive organizational structure to wield it effectively. Artillery barrages needed to be carefully planned and coordinated. Air support needed to be allocated at high levels, scheduled, integrated into operational timelines. The system worked brilliantly when everything functioned as designed, but it was brittle, vulnerable to disruption, slow to adapt. The American system distributed that power downward, allowing low-level commanders to access strategic assets with unprecedented speed. A lieutenant with a radio and a forward air controller could bring down the equivalent of an artillery battalion's worth of firepower within minutes. A tank commander who spotted enemy positions could have fighter bombers overhead before the German forces realized they had been observed. The decentralization meant that even when higher headquarters was disrupted, even when communications were damaged, even when the organizational structure was stressed, the basic machine of air-ground coordination continued to function. German officers, trained to admire efficiency and order, found themselves defeated by a system that appeared disorderly, redundant, even wasteful in its abundance of communication links and overlapping authorities. But that apparent inefficiency concealed a profound effectiveness. The Americans had traded theoretical elegance for practical resilience, and on the battlefield, resilience won. Hauptmann Friedrich Lang had been an instructor at the War College before the war. He understood military theory. He had taught combined arms doctrine. In a prisoner of war camp in Belgium, in February 1945, he tried to explain to a skeptical audience of fellow captives what they had faced. "It is not simply that they have more aircraft," he said, sitting on a rough wooden bench in the barracks. "We understood we would face numerical superiority. What I did not understand, is that they have created a system where quantity becomes quality. Each additional aircraft, each additional radio, each additional forward controller does not merely add to their strength linearly. It multiplies the effectiveness of everything else." Another officer, an artillery commander, shook his head. "We had good soldiers. We had good equipment. We knew our profession." "Yes," Lang agreed. "And none of it mattered because we were fighting within a paradigm they had already transcended. We thought of air power and ground power as separate tools that needed to be coordinated. They built a system where the distinction no longer exists. When you fight their ground forces, you are fighting their air force. When you attempt to move beyond the range of their artillery, you move into the range of their aircraft. There is no sanctuary, no operational space that exists outside their system." The barracks fell silent except for the wind outside. Finally, someone asked the question that had haunted all of them: could we have built such a system? Lang considered. Perhaps. We had the technology. We certainly had talented officers and soldiers. But we would have needed to rethink everything: our doctrine, our organization, our command culture. The Americans built their system from the beginning with integration in mind. We tried to bolt coordination onto existing structures. They designed an organism. We tried to make separate organs cooperate. He paused, then added quietly, "And they had one advantage we could never replicate. They had time. Time to train, time to experiment, time to fail and learn. They built their invasion force in Britain over 2 years, refining their procedures, testing their systems, integrating their forces. We were always reacting, always trying to solve immediate crises. They were engineering a solution to modern war itself." The true impact of American air-ground coordination revealed itself not in any single dramatic battle, but in the steady accumulation of tactical advantages that compounded into strategic transformation. German forces discovered that operations they had executed routinely throughout the war, reconnaissance in force, armored exploitation, tactical withdrawal, became extremely costly or simply impossible under American air supremacy backed by integrated coordination. Reconnaissance in force, a standard technique for identifying enemy positions and strength, required movement and concentration of forces. But American forward air controllers would spot the probe, direct aircraft onto the concentration, and the reconnaissance would become a bloodbath before it could develop useful intelligence. German commanders found themselves blind, unable to gather information without paying a prohibitive price. Armored exploitation, the rapid thrust deep into enemy lines to collapse defensive positions, required speed and mass. But American aircraft could track moving armor formations, report their positions, and vector ground forces to block them while simultaneously conducting strikes against the advancing columns. The very speed that made exploitation effective made it visible and vulnerable. Tank commanders learned that breakthrough was possible, but exploitation was fatal. Even tactical withdrawal, that most basic of military operations, became fraught with danger. Withdrawing forces had to use roads. They had to move in column. They had to expose themselves to observation. American aircraft punished every withdrawal, turning organized retreats into routes, destroying combat power even as units tried to disengage. German forces found themselves trapped in a cruel calculus: stand and be overrun by American ground forces, or withdraw and be devastated by American air power. The cumulative effect was paralysis. Wehrmacht commanders, accustomed to operational flexibility and tactical initiative, found themselves pinned in place by an enemy who didn't need to decisively defeat them in ground combat. They simply needed to make movement impossible. The Americans could accept local stalemates because they knew that German forces trapped in position were forces that could not concentrate, could not maneuver, could not execute the fluid defensive operations that had allowed Germany to hold out against superior numbers for so long. General Major Otto Mahler, commanding a panzer division in the Ruhr pocket in March 1945, wrote in his final report before surrender, "We are not engaged in mobile warfare. We are engaged in a siege where the walls are made of air power. My division has fuel, ammunition, and combat-effective troops. But we cannot move without being destroyed from above. We cannot concentrate without being struck. We cannot even conduct local spoiling attacks without American aircraft appearing within minutes. The traditional relationship between ground and air has been inverted. We are not ground forces occasionally harassed by air attack. We are ground forces completely suppressed by air power, occasionally allowed to move when weather grounds their aircraft. This is not a situation we were trained for. This is not a form of warfare our doctrine addresses. We are obsolete." The transformation of perception happened gradually, then all at once. For months, German commanders had attributed their difficulties to specific tactical problems: American numerical superiority, German fuel shortages, Allied logistics. These were comprehensible challenges within a familiar framework. Then came the moment, different for each commander, but recognizable in retrospect, when the cumulative weight of evidence forced a fundamental reappraisal. For Oberstleutnant Vogel, that moment came in the farmhouse west of St. Vith, staring at a map that no longer made sense according to traditional military logic. For Hauptmann Lang, it came during a desperate withdrawal when aircraft seemed to appear instantaneously at every attempted maneuver. For countless junior officers and enlisted men, it came in fragments, in the sound of approaching engines, in the smoke of destroyed vehicles, in the simple, terrible realization that the sky was an enemy more implacable than any human adversary. The Germans had entered the war believing they had mastered modern combat. They had, in many respects. But the Americans had redefined what modern combat meant, and the definition changed faster than German doctrine could adapt. It was not a failure of intelligence. German officers understood what was happening. It was not a failure of courage. Wehrmacht soldiers continued to fight with skill and determination. It was a failure of paradigm. The conceptual framework through which German military culture understood warfare had been rendered obsolete, and recognizing obsolescence is always harder than identifying specific tactical problems. In prisoner-of-war camps, in hospital wards, in the scattered remnants of units being rebuilt for a defense that everyone knew was futile, German soldiers talked about the American system with a mixture of respect and something approaching awe. They had expected to be outproduced. They had not expected to be conceptually outmaneuvered. The shock was not that they had lost. By 1945, few harbored illusions about the war's outcome, but that they had lost to a form of warfare they had barely understood was possible. Lieutenant Werner Scholz, recuperating from wounds received in an air attack, wrote to his family in March 1945, "They say the Americans are unsophisticated, that they rely on material superiority rather than tactical skill. This is comforting nonsense. What they have built is the most sophisticated military system I have encountered. They have made the sky and the ground into a single battlefield, and they move between them with a fluidity we never achieved even in our best days. If this is what democracy produces, this capacity for innovation, for integration, for transforming industrial power into tactical supremacy, then we were fighting not just a nation but a philosophy, and the philosophy has proven stronger than our valor." The epilogue to this transformation unfolded in the ruined cities of Germany in the spring of 1945. As Wehrmacht forces collapsed, as the Reich disintegrated, American ground forces advanced under an umbrella of air power so complete that the final battles of the war often resembled not combat but cleanup operations. American units moving through devastated landscapes where resistance had already been suppressed from above before ground forces arrived. German military professionals watched this endgame with the peculiar clarity of those who have nothing left to lose. Stripped of propaganda, of nationalism, of the immediate pressures of survival, they could assess what they had faced with something approaching objectivity. And what they saw was not simply American victory, but the emergence of a new form of military organization that would define warfare for decades to come. The principles the Americans had demonstrated, integration of air and ground forces, decentralization of decision-making, technological systems enabling information flow, the use of industrial abundance not just to build more weapons, but to build more responsive and resilient military structures. These would become the template for modern military forces worldwide. The Soviet Union would study American air-ground coordination and develop their own versions. NATO would enshrine it in joint doctrine. Future conflicts would take for granted what the Germans had discovered too late, that air power and ground power were not separate domains to be coordinated, but aspects of a unified combat system. In the immediate aftermath, though, what remained for surviving German commanders was not strategic analysis but memory. Clear skies that brought death. Memory of roads littered with burning vehicles. Memory of the growl of American engines and the whistle of falling ordnance. Memory of a war machine that had seemed invincible in countering a system that rendered traditional military excellence insufficient. In 1948, during the early stages of his denazification proceedings, an American intelligence officer interviewed him about his experiences. The transcript recorded this exchange. "Officer, when did you realize Germany would lose the war?" "Vogel, that is the wrong question. I knew we might lose the war as early as 1942, when the strategic situation became clear. But knowing you will lose and understanding why you must lose are different things. I understood why in January 1945, watching your aircraft destroy my regiment in the Ardennes. We lost because you transformed war itself, and we were still fighting the old war. We were masters of a game whose rules had changed." "Officer, what rules changed?" Vogel, long pause, "All of them. You made the sky and the ground into one battle. You made every soldier an observer and every observation a potential strike. You built a system where information moved faster than we could respond. We thought of combined arms as a tactical technique. You made it the essence of military operations. We lost not to your soldiers, though they fought well, but to your system. And a system born from industrial democracy will always defeat a system born from martial tradition, because democracy learns and adapts faster than tradition can evolve." There is a photograph, taken by an American soldier in April 1945, that captures something essential about this transformation. It shows a Tiger II tank, one of the most formidable armored vehicles ever built, sitting abandoned beside a road in western Germany. The tank itself is undamaged, no penetrations in its thick armor, no internal explosion, no evidence of ground combat. But around it, the earth is cratered by bomb strikes. The road is impassable. Nearby vehicles are destroyed. The Tiger's crew had simply abandoned it, not because it was defeated in combat, but because it could not move without being destroyed from above, could not fight without being targeted by aircraft it had no means to engage, could not fulfill its purpose as an instrument of mobile warfare in an environment where mobility had become fatal. The tank sat there, mechanically perfect and tactically useless, a monument to obsolescence. In that image lies the truth that German commanders learned too late, that warfare is not just about building better weapons or training better soldiers, but about creating systems that allow tools and humans to function together in ways that multiply effectiveness. The Americans had not built better tanks. The Tiger II was arguably superior to any American tank in direct combat. They had not produced better individual soldiers. German troops remained professional and skilled to the end. What the Americans had built was a better system for seeing, deciding, and acting across the entire depth of the battlefield, from the ground to the stratosphere. The Tiger sat by the road, waiting for nothing, while American columns rolled past, columns that moved freely because the sky above them was friendly, because their commanders could see the battlefield through hundreds of eyes, because the barrier between air and ground had been dissolved into something fluid and immediate. The contrast was absolute. One represented the culmination of a martial tradition stretching back through Prussian military excellence to the age of Frederick the Great. The other represented a new synthesis, born from democratic pragmatism and industrial abundance, that had transformed war itself. In the decades following the war, military historians would dissect American air-ground coordination, producing countless studies and doctrinal manuals. They would analyze the technical systems, the organizational structures, the communication protocols. They would turn experience into doctrine, innovation into standard procedure, revolution into routine. But for those who had faced it in the frozen hills of the Ardennes, in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the retreating columns across France and Germany, the experience remained visceral rather than analytical. It remained the memory of skies that were never empty, of movement that invited destruction, of fighting an enemy who seemed to see everything and strike everywhere. It remained the slow, bitter recognition that they had been defeated not by superior courage or even superior numbers, but by a superior idea. The idea that war was not a series of separate domains to be coordinated, but a unified system to be integrated. The radio crackled one final time in that farmhouse west of St. Vith. Oberstleutnant Vogel listened to the fragmentary reports, the calls for support that would not come, the voices of men trapped in a war they could no longer understand according to the categories they had been trained to use. Then the transmission ended, and there was only static and the distant sound of engines in the sky. He set down his cold coffee and turned to his operations officer. "Prepare the regiment to withdraw," he said quietly. "After dark." After dark. When the American aircraft couldn't see. When the sky was neutral again, temporarily, until dawn brought the thunderbolts back and the cycle resumed. It was the only time left for movement, these narrow windows between American shifts, these brief hours of respite from an enemy who had made the very sky into a weapon. Outside, snow began to fall again, and Oberstleutnant Vogel watched it through the frost-covered window and thought about systems and obsolescence and the strange democracy of air power that granted even the lowest American rifleman a connection to forces that could shatter divisions. The snow continued, muffling the world, hiding nothing that mattered. The war would end soon. The system that had defeated them would become the foundation of future warfare. And somewhere, in the continuous evolution of military technology and doctrine, another army would face its own moment of realization, would encounter some new transformation they had failed to anticipate, some innovation that rendered their expertise insufficient. But that would be their war, their recognition, their bitter education. For now, there was only the falling snow, and the sound of American engines in the distance, and the knowledge that they had fought with courage and skill against an idea whose time had come, and the idea had won. In the end, that was what German commanders realized too late, that the power of American air-ground coordination was not in any single weapon or tactic, but in the philosophy that produced it, a philosophy of integration over separation, of information over secrecy, of distributed authority over centralized control. It was democracy made tactical, abundance made strategic, pragmatism made deadly. And against that, all the martial tradition and tactical excellence in the world was not enough. The radio hissed quietly. The snow fell. And somewhere to the west, beyond the American lines, beyond the frozen hills and shattered villages, the next shift of thunderbolts was already taking off, circling, watching, waiting to be called down by men on the ground with radios and colored smoke and the casual expectation that the sky would answer when they called. It always did.